November 24th, 1944, 33,000 feet above the Musashino aircraft plant, Tokyo. The air was thin, a brittle, crystalline void that stole heat and starved engines. For Warrant Officer Saburo Hagiwara, the cockpit of his Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate was no longer a weapon, but a prison of shuddering metal. The control stick felt heavy in his hand, sluggish as if moving through thick mud, and the powerful Homari engine, a source of immense pride at lower altitudes, was now gasping, its vibrations a desperate tremor that resonated through his very bones. His breath rasped in the rubber oxygen mask, each lungful a conscious effort against the pounding headache of hypoxia. Below, the sacred heartland of the Japanese Empire, the sprawling metropolis of Tokyo, was a silent, grey abstraction, but above that was where the nightmare unfolded. They floated in a realm he could not enter, a deeper, purer blue he could only stare at with impotent fury. More than 100 of them, perfect silver crosses, catching the morning sun in blinding flashes. They cruised with an unholy serenity, leaving pristine white contrails scribbled across a sky they now owned. Hagiwara had pushed his fighter, the pinnacle of Japanese aviation engineering, to its absolute limit for nearly 30 minutes. The altimeter needle quivered just past 10,000 meters. This was the edge of his world, and it was not high enough. The American B-29 seconds remained another 2,000 feet above him, untouched, unbothered, flying in a precise geometric formation that spoke of a chilling confidence. Over the radio, the strained, oxygen-starved voices of his fellow pilots echoed his despair. "I cannot reach them. They are like stars," one shouted. Another, a veteran flight leader, gave the grim order, "Positions. If you can. One head. On pass. Do not try to climb. Repeat. Do not try to climb." They were the elite defenders of the homeland, warriors raised on the code of Bushido, yet here they were, reduced to insects clawing at the lid of a jar. They had never expected this. It wasn't combat. It was a terrifying display of technological contempt. Hagiwara watched as the distant puffs of his own flak cannons blossomed harmlessly, pathetically, thousands of feet below the bomber stream. He couldn't believe it. In that moment, a cold, horrifying certainty washed over him. The war was already lost. This moment of profound shock was the culmination of a 2.5-year obsession that had consumed the American war effort. It began with the Doolittle raid in April 1942. Though it caused minimal physical damage, the raid was a psychological cataclysm for the Japanese Empire. The 16 B-25 bombers that appeared over Tokyo shattered the sacred myth of an inviolable homeland, proving that the emperor himself was within reach of American air power. For a nation built on the concept of a divine barrier, it was an unthinkable violation. From that day forward, the Japanese High Command became fixated on expanding their defensive perimeter, leading to the disastrous Midway Campaign. For the Americans, the raid sparked a different obsession: the creation of a weapon that could repeat the mission not with 16 small bombers in a daring one-way raid, but with hundreds of massive superbombers in a relentless, systematic campaign of annihilation. The path to the skies over Tokyo was paved with blood and steel across the Pacific. The critical turning point came in the summer of 1944 with the battle for the Mariana Islands. For Japan, the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were not just island outposts, they were the final gatehouse of their absolute national defense sphere. Their loss was unthinkable. The Japanese garrisons fought with a suicidal ferocity that stunned American Marines and soldiers. On Saipan, facing inevitable defeat, thousands of Japanese soldiers launched a final, hopeless banzai charge, fighting with bayonets, rocks, and bare hands until they were annihilated. More horrifically, thousands of Japanese civilians, convinced by propaganda that they faced torture and death at the hands of the Americans, threw themselves from the island's cliffs. The Japanese leadership had willingly sacrificed nearly their entire 43,000-strong garrison and countless civilians to hold these islands. They understood that if the Marianas fell, the war would be brought to their doorstep, and fall they did. What followed was an act of creation that was, in its own way, as shocking as the violence that preceded it. American Navy Seabees descended upon the island of Tinian and performed an engineering miracle that Japanese planners, grappling with dwindling resources, simply couldn't believe. Within 2 months, they transformed fields of sugarcane into the largest and busiest airfield on the planet. They laid down 6 massive 8,500-foot runways, carving 15 million cubic yards of earth and coral. They built housing, depots, and maintenance facilities for 50,000 personnel. It was a city dedicated to air warfare, built in the time it took Japan's struggling factories to produce a handful of experimental aircraft. From this incredible feat of logistics and labor, the weapon America had spent over $3 billion to create more than the Manhattan Project was about to be unleashed. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was not merely an aircraft, it was a prophecy of a new kind of war. Japanese intelligence had reports on it, but the numbers seemed like fantasy, arrogant American propaganda. Their pilots and commanders, confident in their nimble, battle-hardened fighters and their own superior warrior spirit, laughed at the idea of a heavy bomber being a decisive weapon. They had handled the B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds over China and the South Pacific. They were tough, yes, but they could be bled, their formations broken, their crews worn down. The Japanese expected a brutal, grinding battle of attrition over the homeland. They expected a fight they could win through sheer willpower. They never understood, until it was far too late, that the B-29 was not an evolution of the old bombers. It was a revolution. It was a machine designed to erase the very concept of a fair fight. The utter helplessness felt by Warrant Officer Hagiwara and his comrades was not born of a simple performance gap. It was the result of a technological chasm so wide it represented a different philosophy of war altogether. While Japanese aviation had perfected the art of the lightweight, agile dogfighter, an extension of the pilot's own warrior spirit, the Americans had created a flying fortress that was a self-contained, high-altitude ecosystem, a marvel of engineering that systematically negated every advantage the Japanese defenders thought they possessed. When Japanese intelligence officers and engineers began piecing together the unbelievable truth from crash sites and the rare interrogation of a captured crewman, the reports they sent to the High Command were met with stunned disbelief. The first and most shocking revelation was the B-29's pressurized crew compartments. For the Japanese pilot, the high-altitude battlefield was a personal hell. At 33,000 feet, the outside temperature was a brutal negative 50 degrees Celsius. In his unheated cockpit, the pilot's own breath would freeze into a fine mist on the inside of the canopy, obscuring his vision. His body, even with a heated flight suit, was racked with a deep, penetrating cold that stiffened his joints and slowed his reactions. The thin air was a constant enemy. His rudimentary oxygen system provided just enough to prevent blackout, but not enough to stave off the creeping mental fog of hypoxia. His blood, saturated with nitrogen at sea level, began to fizz like a carbonated drink in the low pressure, causing agonizing pain in his joints, a condition aviators called the bends. He was a man fighting his own physiology, his own mortality, long before he ever saw the enemy. He was, in effect, already wounded. Now consider the American crew. When Japanese engineers first examined the wreckage of a B-29's fuselage, they couldn't believe what they found. It was a comfortable, climate-controlled environment. The 10-man crew operated in a shirt-sleeve environment, wearing simple jackets as if on a cool autumn day. The air pressure was maintained at a comfortable 8,000 feet. They were alert, warm, and could perform their complex duties for hours on end without physical degradation. A pressurized tunnel, wide enough for a man to crawl through, connected the forward cockpit to the midsection gunnery compartment, allowing crew members to move between sections or even tend to the wounded. They could drink coffee, eat sandwiches, and communicate with crystal clarity over a quiet intercom system, a stark contrast to the scream of a straining engine and the crackle of a high-frequency radio that filled a Japanese pilot's helmet. It was a revelation that was deeply demoralizing. The Americans had not just built a better airplane, they had conquered the environment itself. They had created a machine where the human operator was the most protected and efficient component, while the Japanese pilot remained a fragile piece of flesh at the mercy of the stratosphere. This environmental dominance was made possible by the B-29's heart, its 4 Wright R 3350 duplex Cyclone engines. These were arguably the most complex and powerful piston engines ever mass-produced. each one a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. But their true genius lay in their two General Electric turbo-superchargers. A Japanese engineer examining the mangled remains of one of these engines would have been shocked by its sophistication. A supercharger acts as a lung, forcing air into the engine so it can breathe in the thin atmosphere of high altitude. Japanese engines used simple, gear-driven superchargers that were effective up to about 25,000 feet. Above that, they were simply unable to compress enough air, and the engine's power would plummet. The American turbo-supercharger was a far more elegant and powerful solution. It used the engine's own searing hot exhaust gases wasted energy in a Japanese engine to spin a turbine wheel at over 20,000 revolutions per minute. This turbine, in turn, drove a centrifugal compressor that packed air into the engine with tremendous force, allowing the B-29 to maintain its full power rating at altitudes where a Ki 84's engine was suffocating. The reason for this technological gap was a simple, brutal matter of resources and industrial science. The turbine blades had to withstand temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius while spinning at incredible speeds. This required advanced, secret alloys heavily reliant on nickel and cobalt rare metals that America had in abundance and which Japan desperately lacked. The Japanese simply could not produce the materials necessary to copy the technology, even if they had the designs. The B-29's engines were a direct product of America's vast geological and scientific wealth. If the pressurization and engines created an untouchable sanctuary, the defensive armament made that sanctuary an active killing ground. The General Electric remote-controlled fire control system was a terrifying enigma to Japanese pilots. They had never known a bomber could fight like this. A veteran ace, trained to identify the blind spots on a B-17 or B-24, would approach a B-29 from the rear low quarter, traditionally the safest angle. He would line up his sights, confident in his approach, and then be met with a horrifying sight. The barrels of the upper forward turret, the lower rear turret, and the tail guns would all swivel in perfect, synchronized motion, tracking him as if guided by an unseen hand. The system's analog computers, a maze of gyroscopes and electrical servos, were instantly calculating his speed, his angle of approach, and the precise amount of lead required to hit him. The American gunner wasn't desperately wrestling with a heavy, vibrating machine gun. He was sitting at a comfortable station, calmly manipulating a hand controller and peering through a gyroscopically stabilized sight. He could be sitting in the plexiglass nose and controlling the tail turret 100 feet away. A single gunner could even control multiple turrets, concentrating an unbelievable storm of 50-caliber slugs into a single patch of sky. For the Japanese pilot, it felt like fighting a ghost. There was no single human to outwit, no gunner to surprise. There was only the cold, unerring logic of the machine, and it was a logic that dealt in death. Ultimately, the most demoralizing weapon of all was not a piece of technology, but a number on a spreadsheet. It was the sheer, crushing scale of American production. When the first B-29 seconds appeared, the Japanese military believed them to be a handful of special, experimental aircraft. They never expected the flood that was to come. At its peak, Boeing's plant in Wichita, Kansas, a single factory was completing a new B-29 every 4.5 hours. The production lines in Wichita, Renton, and Marietta ran 24 hours a day, fueled by a seemingly infinite supply of aluminum, steel, and skilled labor. By the end of the war, 3,970 of these complex superbombers would be built. Japan, by contrast, had managed to produce only a handful of its experimental high-altitude interceptors, none of which were truly effective. Their aircraft industry was a scattered network of small factories and workshops, constantly on the move to escape the very bombing they were supposed to be stopping, and starved of everything from high-grade aluminum to rubber to trained personnel. An intelligence officer in the Japanese Army Air Force, looking at the confirmed reports of American production numbers, would have been gripped by a cold despair. It wasn't a war anymore. It was an industrial avalanche. America wasn't just building planes to fight a war. They were building planes to erase the enemy's entire capacity to exist. Faced with a weapon they could not reach, armed with technology they could not counter, and produced on a scale they could not comprehend, the Japanese military high command was plunged into a state of strategic paralysis. The calm, detached confidence that had marked the early years of the war evaporated, replaced by a frantic, almost hysterical search for a solution. The B-29 did more than just threaten their cities. It threatened the very foundation of their warrior ethos. The Bushido Code, with its emphasis on spiritual strength overcoming material disadvantage, was rendered meaningless by a machine that operated in a different dimension, a distant, untouchable god of war. This existential crisis forced a horrifying transformation in Japanese defensive strategy, a descent from tactical ingenuity into the dark calculus of suicide. The initial response was one of sheer desperation. Engineers were ordered to perform miracles. The handful of high-altitude interceptor prototypes, like the Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden and the Kawasaki Ki-61I, were rushed into production, but it was a futile gesture. These aircraft, while potent, were complex to manufacture and maintain, and the shattered Japanese industrial base could only produce them in insignificant numbers. For every advanced interceptor that reached the front lines, 100 B-29 seconds were rolling off the assembly lines in America. More pathetically, maintenance crews were ordered to strip existing fighters of every non-essential component to reduce weight. Armor plating, radios, and even machine guns were removed from aircraft like the Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki. The theory was that a lighter plane might be able to claw its way a few hundred feet higher to get just one fleeting chance at the enemy. Pilots were sent up in what were essentially flying shells, their only defense being a desperate hope and the skill of their hands. They were horrified to find that even these stripped-down fighters could barely touch the bottom of the bomber streams. As the futility of conventional interception became crushingly apparent, a much darker strategy began to emerge from the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. If the guns of their fighters could not destroy the enemy, then the fighters themselves would become the weapon. This was the genesis of the Shinton Saikutai, the heaven-shaking air superiority units. These were not the organized, widespread kamikaze attacks that would later be used against the US Navy. These were specialized air-to-air ramming squadrons, a last-ditch defense born of pure despair. Commanders of fighter Sentai were ordered to form special flights of pilots who would volunteer for Tayatari, body-crashing, missions. The pilots, many of them barely out of their teens and imbued with a fanatical devotion to the emperor, were told that this was the purest expression of the samurai spirit. Their bodies, they were told, were the final, sacred shield of the homeland. The men who volunteered for these missions were not necessarily suicidal. They were trapped by a logic that had lost all connection to reality. Captain Masao Itagaki, a pilot in a ramming unit, later described the chilling mindset. "We were told our technology was inferior. We were told we could not reach them. So, what was left? Only our spirit. To fly your plane directly into the enemy was seen as the ultimate act of will, a way to prove that Japanese spirit could still triumph over American machines. The tactics were simple and brutal. Pilots in stripped-down fighters would attempt a frantic climb to get above and in front of a B-29 formation. They would then execute a diving attack, aiming their own aircraft at the wing root or the tail assembly of a superfortress. They were supposed to try and bail out just before impact, but everyone knew this was a fiction. The closing speeds, often exceeding 500 miles per hour, made survival a virtual impossibility. American B-29 crews, flying their first missions over Japan, were stunned by this tactic. They had been briefed on Japan's elite fighters, but they had never expected a deliberate, suicidal ramming attack. A tail gunner on a B-29 named Dynamite gave a breathless account after a mission in December 1944. "We saw him coming, climbing like crazy, smoke pouring from his engine. He wasn't shooting, he just kept coming, getting bigger and bigger in the sight. Our guns were hitting him all over, pieces were flying off his wings, but he didn't stop. He flew his plane right into the tail of the ship next to us. There was a huge flash, and they were both just gone, just a ball of fire, and then nothing. We couldn't believe what we had just seen." While these ramming attacks did manage to down a small number of B-29 seconds, their strategic impact was negligible. For every superfortress lost, dozens more would appear on the next mission. But the psychological effect was profound. It was a terrifying confirmation to the Americans of the enemy's fanatical mindset, and a horrifying admission to the Japanese that they had been reduced from skilled aviators to human-guided missiles. The ultimate failure of this desperate strategy was that it played directly into America's greatest strength. The United States could lose a 10-man B-29 crew and the complex machine they flew in, and have both replaced within days. The industrial and training pipeline was that massive. For Japan, the loss of a single experienced pilot was a catastrophic blow they could not recover from. By ordering their best and bravest to commit suicide against an unending stream of bombers, the Japanese High Command was systematically destroying the very core of its own air force. They were feeding their last remaining seed corn into the furnace. This brutal, lopsided arithmetic was the final, horrifying proof of the B-29's dominance. It had created a strategic problem for which the only Japanese solution was self-annihilation. The failure of Japan's desperate air-to-air ramming tactics was a grim footnote in a war that was rapidly accelerating toward a new and even more terrible phase. On the island of Tinian, a new American commander had arrived, a man who cared little for elegant theories of air power or the warrior spirit of his enemy. Major General Curtis LeMay was a blunt, cigar-chomping pragmatist, a man who measured success in only one metric: results. And the results of the high-altitude daylight bombing campaign were, in his view, pathetic. The B-29 seconds were flying with near impunity, but they were not achieving their objective. Their high-explosive bombs, dropped from over 6 miles up, were frequently missing their targets, the crucial aircraft factories and industrial centers around Tokyo. The reason was an invisible enemy that American intelligence had never expected: the jet stream. This powerful river of wind, roaring over Japan at more than 200 miles per hour, was wreaking havoc on their bomb sites and scattering the bomb loads across the landscape. To LeMay, flying missions that risked hundreds of men and multi-million-dollar aircraft for such poor results was not just inefficient, it was stupid. He was horrified not by the enemy's defenses, but by his own command's lack of effectiveness. He looked at the problem with the cold, detached logic of an engineer and came to a conclusion so radical, so ruthless, that it stunned his own superiors and terrified his flight crews. LeMay decided to completely change the rules of the game. He would abandon the entire doctrine of high-altitude precision bombing that had guided the American air war until that point. His new plan was a gamble of breathtaking audacity. First, the B-29 seconds would no longer attack from the stratosphere. They would go in low, between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, where the jet stream was not a factor, and bombing accuracy would be guaranteed. Second, they would attack at night. LeMay had correctly assessed that Japan's night fighter force was virtually non-existent and that its radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery was primitive and ineffective. Third, they would not fly in tight defensive formations but as individual aircraft in a continuous stream, overwhelming the defenses with sheer numbers. But it was his final order that revealed the true, terrifying nature of his new strategy. The B-29 seconds were to be stripped of nearly all their defensive machine guns, ammunition, and even some crew members. This was not a sign of weakness, it was a calculated trade. The immense weight savings would allow each bomber to carry not high-explosive bombs, but a crushing 7-ton payload of a new type of weapon, the M69 incendiary bomb. American crews were aghast. They felt they were being sent out naked, their flying fortresses stripped of their defensive sting, to fly low and slow over one of the most heavily defended cities on Earth. They couldn't believe the order. It seemed like a suicide mission. What the crews didn't understand, but what Japanese civil defense authorities were about to learn in the most brutal way possible, was that the M69 was a weapon of almost diabolical genius, designed with the cold precision of a chemist for one specific purpose: to burn down Japanese cities. It was not a conventional bomb. It was a 500-pound cluster bomb that, upon release, would open in mid-air and scatter 38 smaller, 6-pound bomblets. These bomblets, nicknamed Tokyo calling cards, were hexagonal tubes filled with an early form of napalm-jellied gasoline. They were designed not to explode on impact, but to punch through the flimsy tile or wood roofs of Japanese homes and workshops. A timed fuse would then ignite the payload, shooting a jet of flaming, sticky jelly for 100 feet. A single B-29 could now seed an area the size of several city blocks with thousands of these small, intense, and unstoppable fires. The Japanese High Command was completely oblivious to this impending tactical shift. They were still focused on the high-altitude problem, still trying to develop fighters that could reach 35,000 feet. Their entire defensive posture, the placement of flak guns, the training of their pilots, the location of their observer corps was geared toward a threat from the stratosphere. They never knew that their enemy had looked at their cities of wood, bamboo, and paper and decided to stop targeting the factories and instead target the flammable urban landscape itself. LeMay wasn't just planning to destroy Japan's ability to make war. He was planning to burn its society to the ground. The greatest industrial power in the world had decided to pivot its entire strategic air arm to a campaign of scientifically applied arson. On the night of the 9th of March 1945, as hundreds of B-29 seconds took off from Tinian, their bomb bays filled not with steel but with fire, the stage was set for a night of horror that would exceed anything the world had ever seen. On the night of the 9th of March 1945, the air over the Bozo Peninsula was filled with an unfamiliar sound. Japanese coastal observers, huddled in their lookout posts, heard it first. A low, deep, guttural drone that grew steadily from the east. It was the sound of American bombers, but it was wrong. It was too low, too close. Their reports, when radioed to the Eastern District Army headquarters in Tokyo, were met with confusion and disbelief. The High Command was expecting phantoms in the stratosphere, not a black river of unseen aircraft roaring just a few thousand feet over the waves. The few radar sets they possessed were aimed high, sweeping the empty stratosphere, completely blind to the approaching armada. Japan was a nation braced for an attack from heaven, completely unprepared for the demons that were about to crawl in through the cellar door. Just after midnight, the first B-29 seconds, the Pathfinders appeared over Tokyo. They didn't target the Imperial Palace or the centers of government. Their objective was a sprawling, densely populated, 1-2 square mile rectangle in the heart of the Shitamachi district. This was the city's working-class core, a labyrinth of narrow streets, wooden homes, and small cottage industries, a place where families built the small components for Japan's war machine in their living rooms. The Pathfinders dropped their incendiaries, which blossomed into a brilliant, fiery X in the heart of the sleeping city. It was a target marker for the 300 bombers that followed close behind. What happened next was not a battle, it was a deluge. For nearly 3 hours, a relentless stream of B-29 seconds passed over the target. Flying as low as 5,000 feet, the sound of their 4 massive engines was a deafening, earth-shaking roar that was terrifying in itself. From their open bomb bays rained a storm of fire. The M69 bomblets punched through the flimsy rooftops and ignited inside the wooden homes, transforming thousands of individual family dwellings into thousands of individual torches, all at once. The initial response from Tokyo's civil defense was brave but pathetic. Neighborhood fire brigades, equipped with little more than hand pumps and buckets, were overwhelmed in minutes. The small fires they were trained to fight were suddenly everywhere, merging and combining with terrifying speed. The people of Tokyo, jolted from their sleep, were shocked into a state of primal fear. They ran from their burning homes into streets that were already becoming rivers of fire. They had been told the Americans were targeting factories, but they saw their homes, their schools, their entire world being consumed. The heat grew with astonishing speed. Within 30 minutes of the first bombs falling, the thousands of individual fires began to coalesce. They created a meteorological event of almost supernatural horror, a firestorm. A firestorm is a self-sustaining conflagration that creates its own weather system. The superheated air over the burning city, reaching temperatures of 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, rose with incredible force, creating a vacuum at ground level. This vacuum sucked in fresh air from the edges of the fire at hurricane force. These fire winds, estimated at over 150 miles per hour, were strong enough to pick people up off their feet and hurl them into the heart of the inferno. The wind fed the flames, which in turn heated more air, creating an ever more powerful and unstoppable vortex of destruction. For the people trapped inside, it was an apocalypse. The air itself became a weapon. It was so hot that it seared the lungs of those who tried to breathe it, killing them instantly. The Sumida River, where tens of thousands fled for safety, began to boil. Steel bridges glowed red and sagged into the water. The canals evaporated. People seeking refuge in concrete buildings were cooked alive as the structures turned into ovens. A thick, oily black snow, a mixture of soot, ash, and unburnt debris began to fall, covering everything in a greasy shroud. Survivor accounts speak of a horror that defies language. A young girl, Michiko Kyuka, recalled, "The wind was roaring and my father's head just burst into flames. People were running with their backs on fire. The whole world was a sea of fire." The Japanese people couldn't believe this was happening. They were not being defeated. They were being erased. Even the American crews, safe in their machines miles above, were horrified by what they had created. The updrafts from the firestorm were so violent they tossed the 70-ton bombers around like toys, flipping some nearly upside down. The stench of burning wood, rubber, and human flesh was so strong that it filled their cockpits, forcing many to put on their oxygen masks. The city below was no longer a city. It was a glowing, white-hot crater, a man-made sun that lit the sky so brightly that pilots could read their instruments without cockpit lights. One pilot, Robert Rodenhouse, later said, "It was just a sea of fire. I've never seen anything like it, and I never want to see anything like it again." When dawn broke on March 10th, it revealed a scene of utter desolation. A thick pall of smoke hung over Tokyo, obscuring a landscape that was no longer recognizable. 16 square miles of the world's most populous city had been completely incinerated, reduced to a flat, smoking plain of ash and charred rubble. The official death toll was listed at around 84,000, but modern historians agree the true number was well over 100,000, with more than 1 million left homeless. In a single night, more people had died in Tokyo than in the initial blasts of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The Japanese government was stunned into silence. They attempted to censor the news, but it was impossible. The hundreds of thousands of burned and homeless survivors became walking proof of a new, terrible reality. The B-29 had transformed from a high-altitude threat into an instrument of annihilation, and LeMay's fire had burned away any remaining Japanese hope of a negotiated peace. There was only survival. The apocalyptic inferno of March 10th was not an end. For the stunned and terrified people of Japan, it was a beginning. The firestorm of Tokyo was the proof of concept for LeMay's new strategy, and he immediately unleashed his B-29 seconds on every other major city in Japan. The names became a litany of destruction. Nagoya, a center of aircraft production. Osaka, the nation's industrial hub. Kobe, a major port. 66 cities in total would be visited by the B-29 seconds, and 66 cities would burn. The Japanese people never knew which city would be next. A new, terrifying routine of nightly air raid sirens and frantic dashes to inadequate shelters became the norm. The psychological effect was devastating. The government's propaganda, which had once spoken of glorious victory, was now reduced to pleading with citizens to build bucket brigades and fight fires with their bare hands, a futile gesture against the industrial might of the United States. By the summer of 1945, Japan's urban landscape had been effectively erased. The numbers were so staggering they became abstract. The B-29 seconds had dropped over 160,000 tons of bombs, the vast majority of them incendiaries. Over 180 square miles of urban area were incinerated. Nearly 30% of the entire population of Japan's cities had been rendered homeless. The country's industrial capacity, which relied on thousands of small workshops scattered throughout these residential areas, had completely collapsed. The Japanese High Command couldn't believe the speed and totality of the destruction. Their nation was not being defeated in battle, it was being systematically unbuilt, deindustrialized, and burned back to a pre-modern age, one city at a time. It was in this context of total societal collapse that the B-29 performed its final and most famous mission. On the 6th of August, 1945, a single superfortress, the Enola Gay, appeared high in the stratosphere over the city of Hiroshima. It flew at over 31,000 feet, once again an untouchable silver speck, just as the first B-29 seconds had been over Tokyo. The few Japanese fighters that rose to intercept it could only watch, helpless, from miles below. The Enola Gay was not on a firebombing mission. It was the delivery system for the culmination of American scientific power, the atomic bomb. 3 days later, another B-29, Boxcar, would do the same over Nagasaki. For the Japanese leadership, The atomic bombs were not a new type of war, but the terrifyingly efficient perfection of the war the B-29 had already been waging. The firebombing raids had proven that a force of 300 bombers could destroy a city in 3 hours. The atomic bomb demonstrated that a single bomber could now do it in 3 seconds. The psychological shock was absolute. It was the final, undeniable proof that America possessed a power that was almost godlike, a power against which there was no defense, no negotiation, and no hope. The Emperor's decision to finally surrender was not just because of 2 atomic bombs. It was because of the 9 months of relentless destruction delivered by the B-29 seconds, which had already broken the nation's body and spirit. After the war, when Allied interrogators spoke with the captured leaders of Japan, the story was always the same. They were not defeated by any single battle, but by the overwhelming industrial and technological avalanche that the B-29 symbolized. Prince Fumimaro Konoe, a former prime minister, stated bluntly, "The thing that brought about the determination to make peace was the prolonged bombing by the B-29 seconds." General Genda Minoru, the architect of Pearl Harbor, admitted that the B-29 was the single weapon that had rendered their entire strategy obsolete. "When we first saw it flying so high, we were shocked," he said. "We tried everything. We formed ramming units. We tried to build rocket planes. Nothing worked. We knew then that we could not protect our home. That knowledge was the beginning of the end." The B-29 Superfortress remains a deeply controversial weapon, an instrument of immense destruction that forever changed the nature of warfare. But as a machine, it was an undeniable triumph of American engineering, logistics, and industrial philosophy. It was a weapon that reflected the nation that built it, audacious, overwhelming, and ruthlessly efficient. It was designed to solve the problem of a fanatical, determined enemy by creating a technological equation where that enemy's courage was no longer a relevant variable. The story of the B-29 is the story of a nation's laughter turning to horror. In 1944, Japanese pilots like Warrant Officer Hagiwara looked up and saw an enemy they could not touch, and they were horrified. By the spring of 1945, the people on the ground looked up and saw a sky raining fire, and their horror became an inferno. The B-29 did not just win battles, it ended a nation's ability to fight. It was the silver-plated messenger of a new and terrible kind of power, a power that proved, once and for all, that in the crucible of modern industrial warfare, the spirit of the warrior is no match for the ghost in the machine.